Welcome, everybody. I'm Ian Vasquez, Vice President for International Studies at the Cato Institute, and we're holding this forum today at UCEMA University in Buenos Aires, where I've spent the last few days meeting with government officials, economists, and other scholars to talk about Javier Milei's ambitious reform agenda as we approach his one-year anniversary in office. President Milei, when he came in, inherited a country on the verge of hyperinflation, a collapse in growth, 40 to 50% poverty, high unemployment, high debt, and massive fiscal deficits. In a short period of time, he's accomplished much more than what most people thought was possible. He has cut public spending significantly, he has produced fiscal surpluses, and he has reduced monthly inflation rates down to single digits. What's going on in Argentina is nothing short of impressive. Today, we're going to focus on one aspect of reform, and we're going to talk about dollarization and how that fits into President Milei's overall reform program. Milei campaigned on a central promise of eliminating the central bank and dollarizing the economy. He is still fully committed to that reform, but that has not yet taken place. As the economy stabilizes, why do so many experts, including the president himself, still consider dollarization to be such a key reform in Argentina? Can dollarization still be achieved? What would it look like? And what will it take to get it done? To answer these questions, I'm very pleased to have joined me three of Argentina's most distinguished experts on dollarization. Joining me here in person is Emilio Ocampo and Alfredo Romano. Joining me remotely is Nicolas Cachanosky. Emilio Ocampo, and actually before I introduce each one of them, I should remind the online viewers that if they want to send in a question, that they can do so through Cato's webpage or through its YouTube account or its Facebook account or its X account using the hashtag Cato Events. So let me introduce our panelists. Emilio Ocampo is a professor of finance and economic history at UCEMA University here in Buenos Aires. He has taught at NYU's Stern School of Business. He has more than 20 years experience in international financial and capital markets. And in recent years, he is the co-author of two books on dollarization, one that's called Dollarization, a Solution for Argentina, which he co-authored with Nicolas Cachanosky, and another one that came out earlier this year called Dollarized Argentina, which he co-authored with Alfredo Romano. Alfredo Romano is president of the Romano Group, and he is a professor of finance and economics at Austral University. He received his degree in public administration from Columbia University, and as I mentioned, he's the co-author with Emilio Ocampo of Dollarized Argentina. Nicolas Cachanosky is associate professor of economics at the University of Texas in El Paso, where he is also the director of the Center for Free Enterprise, and he is a fellow at UCEMA University here in Buenos Aires, where he's a fellow at the Friedman Hayek Center for the Study of Free Society, and as I mentioned, he's the co-author with Emilio Ocampo on the book Dollarization, a Solution for Argentina. So let's begin, Emilio, with a more basic, a more general question. Dollarization is a term that different people use in different ways. Sometimes it's not well understood. What do you mean by dollarization when you talk about it?
Hi, Ian. Thank you very much for inviting me to join this forum. And I think this is a very important question because when you debate something and you're not clear about what the terms mean, you can generate a lot of confusion. And this has been a problem because dollarization is a generic term. And as a generic term, it means essentially that the dollar as a currency replaces some of or all the functions of a local currency like the peso. But I always like to say that the term dollarization itself is like a sandwich. And the dollar is the bread, but you can have a ham and cheese sandwich or a cheese and tomato or a steak sandwich. You can do it in many different ways. So when you want to debate about dollarization, what you really have to do is to be clear about what you have in mind. For example, there are some countries that decided to adopt the dollar as legal tender and kept a local currency, where some other countries eliminated the local currency, and some other countries adopted several currencies as legal tender. So there are many ways to skin the cat, as people say in the US. And so in my case, when I talk about dollarization for Argentina, after studying how it was done in many countries, I'm talking about essentially official dollarization being a decision made by the government to adopt the dollar as legal tender, and not necessarily eliminate outright the peso, but simply adopting, giving the dollar the same status, the same legal status as the peso. And legal tender, for those that are not familiar with the term, means when a currency has legal tender, it means that it has the ability to cancel any obligation, like taxes, debts, or whatever, within the national territory. So in this context, and I think whenever you look at a particular country, you have to look at the situation from the legal aspects, because some countries have constitutions that establish certain boundaries in monetary matters that you have to take into consideration, financial matters, political matters, and so there's no one-size-fits-all for dollarization. You need to adapt it to the particular circumstances of a particular country in a particular period of time.
There's been a lot of different experiences in dollarization. I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more, and the exact moment when different countries decided to dollarize were different in each case. In Argentina today, what does the economy look like? How is it performing as we talk about dollarization, Alfredo?
Yeah, well, I think that there are two important things that we have to highlight from this. Sorry, there's an issue with my. Okay, I don't
It's
see
okay.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah. First one, the fiscal program.
Yep.
It's the government has slashed the fiscal deficit by far more than 5% of our GDP, and Milei is reducing the size of the state. And that is great for the last 123 years, we have, we only had 10 years with financial surplus, fiscal surpluses. So, and he's completely, convinced that the next year we'll have a surplus or even, a fiscal balance. So that is really important because we all know that, when you have to reduce the fiscal, in the fiscal area, it's an unpopular measure. For example, tightening the funds for university, that was really hard, even though we can see that nowadays the government still has, the positive image surpasses 50%, and that is unbelievable for Argentina. So in the second place, I would like to highlight, and that also contributes to dollarization, it's the tax amnesty program. More than $20 billion have been declared in the economy, and that has skyrocketed the balance of the central bank and the deposits. Our credit has grown in the last couple of months by far more than 8 billion, and so we can conclude that there is no problem of dollars in our economy. The problem is with confidence. People don't trust governments. They don't trust their measures, and that is the tough thing that Argentina has to face.
Yeah. Well, when Javier Milei came in, he had seen an inflation rate of 25% during the month of December alone. That was the first month that he was in office. And that has just been reduced. The government announced this last month of October to 2.7%. That's a big reduction. They're going to continue to go down. and we're talking about monthly inflation rate figures. Nicolas, if inflation has gone down, why is dollarization necessary? And if the economy is already seemingly starting to rebound, and there's a lot of good indicators about that, why do we even need to talk about dollarization?
Well, mind you, we're talking about Argentina. So you can go through a list of, positive reforms that Milei's government is doing. Just to mention a few, the fiscal balance, reducing the inflation rate, the regulation approaches. Hopefully, we see more progress on labor market reforms, an intention to attract foreign investments. So there is a lot of focus to solve problems that needs to be solved. But we also need to work with the assumption that the likelihood that Argentina will elect a new populist or a new Peronista is probably 100%. In Argentina, institutions don't account for much. So just with a snap of fingers, a new government can revert everything you see positive that Milei is doing. So when you think about dollarization, you need to separate two things. One is monetary policy component, if you want. And it's giving you something that is not minor in Argentina already, which is price stability, but in a credible way. I remind you that since 1940s to today, the average inflation rate in Argentina is around 60%. So you're talking about a country with a long history of high and volatile inflation. It doesn't matter who is in government. And also remember, when Cambiemos was in office, popular inflation targeting rules fail. I think Argentina is the only country that applies inflation targeting and it fails. They had their own quarrel with the central bank when the government was forcing them to change interest rates. So the credibility that your central bank will be able, not know how, but able to keep a price stability is very low. And this is where the other component of dollarization comes in. It's also an institutional shield, a sort of protection to future bad policies. If you compare, for instance, populism in Ecuador and in Argentina, both of them do bad economic policies. Very similarly, you can make the case that Correa was more powerful than the Kirchneristas. Remember that Correa was able to reform the constitution and the Kirchneristas were not. But if you're going to have a populist regime, if you're going to make bad policies, is there a way to reduce the cost of that? And dollarization helps you with that. Populism was less costly in Ecuador than it was in Argentina. So I think the argument that, well, we are solving the macroeconomy, we are solving this problem, so why to dollarize, is short-sighted in the sense that this government eventually is going to not be a government anymore, and will once again be in the hands of an irresponsible fiscal manager.
So that's an institutional argument, which I think carries especially a lot of weight in Argentina. Emilio, you said that under your view of dollarization, the peso could still exist alongside the dollar, but what about the central bank?
Well, the way we, Nico and I, we work on a proposal, what we imagine is, even if the peso exists, you freeze the stock of pesos in the economy. So there's no need to have a central bank printing more money. I mean, the amount of pesos in the economy gets frozen, so you wouldn't have that problem. But I would like to add something to what Nico said, which is very important, because you mentioned at the beginning how the legacy of the last populist government and how bad Argentina was. And we had 4 terrible years under the Fernandez government, and now things are going in the right direction. The government is doing the right thing. I've never seen a more dynamic government in terms of announcing every day measures that will tend to increase productivity and make the economy more efficient. I mean, everything that's been done on the micro side and the structural side is very positive. Obviously, disinflation also is very encouraging. If you look back in history, the disinflation curve of this program is second only to what was accomplished under the convertibility plan. But I'm always reminded of this quote by Sir John Templeton. He said, the four most dangerous words in investing are, this time is different. And I think the problem we have here is that we're not, a lot of people feel that this time is different, and clearly the reasons to believe that this time is different, because Milei is certainly different, and what he has accomplished is quite extraordinary, as you mentioned, but we're not going to know whether this time is different until, 2035 or 2040. And as Nico mentioned earlier, when you have to question yourself and say, what's the probability that in the next 10, 15 years, another Peronist comes to power? And I'm always reminded of the 90s. I mean, the 90s we had the most successful reform program in the last 80 years in Argentina. And nobody imagined, let's say in 1998, when things were at the best possible time for comfortability, nobody imagined that we would have something called Kirchnerismo that will come in and revert every single positive reform that was done during that decade, and it actually happened. So the issue of basically ensuring that if another populist government comes into place, they don't destroy the economy and put us again against the wall again in terms of the inflation rate. And that's where the argument for dollarization, I think, is particularly strong. And specifically, with the central bank, Milei was very clear, and I think he reiterated this in many recent speeches that he gave, that he wants to close the central bank. And we have to wonder, why do we still need in Argentina a central bank? I'm not talking about the supervisory function. I'm talking about a central bank that has so mishandled monetary policy that we are the #1 country. I mean, we hold the record of the highest inflation rate for the last 70 years. So clearly, the idea that we're going to have an independent central bank in Argentina has been proven to be chimerical, because on paper, if you look at the statutes and whatever, we do have an independent central bank. In practice, we know that the central bank is totally controlled by the political power. So if you don't have access to an independent central bank and you have an addiction to populism, you better find a way to limit the damage that populism can do. And the biggest damage comes from excess spending financed by money printing. And so that I think, takes you to, I think, the strongest institutional argument in favor of dollarization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would like to add that we just talked about the fiscal balance, that it's great, but even though Javier Milei has to face 2 vetoes, there's a lot of political there isn't a political consensus still in Argentina that fiscal balance and monetary discipline. So
Go ahead.
So fiscal discipline are the key points, for growth and for development. So that is a problem, because we still have some political leaders that complain those measures. For example, in the last couple of days, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, who nowadays she represents Peronism, and she governed us for more than 10 years, and she still believes that the problem with inflation in Argentina, it's related, to an scarcity of international reserves. And she believes that printing money does not affect the monetary policy. So I think that we are really mature. Still, we are really mature as a society. We don't have the discipline to face this new process. And in the long run, as Emilio and Nicolas just said, probably populism will come back to Argentina, and that is the main issue.
Well, I think that's what Nicolas was referring to when he spoke about Ecuador, that had a populist president, Correa, but it was dollarized, so it put real limits on what he could do. Some of us have said that if it weren't for dollarization, Ecuador would have turned into Venezuela. And it seems to me that that even if things go in the best of ways under Milei, and they have a disciplined fiscal policy and really good monetary policy, and the economy starts growing, you know, Emilio, you just said nobody in the 90s expected that there was going to be a reversion to the bad old populism, but it did happen. I think today people do have that in Argentina in the back of their minds, and just that uncertainty really does reduce the economic potential of Argentina, even if they do everything right with a central bank. Would you agree with that?
I totally agree with you. And if, in fact, if you talk to foreign investors, everybody's extremely excited about what Argentina is doing, but people are saying, okay, let's see, because everybody's aware of Argentina's history. And so, as I said, you know, maybe this time is different, but we're not really going to know for a number of years whether it was different or not. So I think it's that history still weighs on us and creates uncertainty, and that uncertainty affects the flow of investments, etc. So that thing hanging over our head is definitely a bad thing, and that's what you need to eliminate, that kind of uncertainty.
Nicolas, Argentina is largely dollarized already. People have dollars. I think it probably wouldn't be difficult to officially dollarize. What, in your view, are the biggest obstacles or the biggest reasons given for not dollarizing when it seems like people have sort of already chosen on their own what monetary system or what currency, at least, they prefer?
Yes, let me add that the way I see, before I answer your question, keeping a central bank, if you're going to formally dollarize, is taking an unnecessary risk. You don't need to keep your central bank if you dollarize. Panama was dollarized for more than 100 years and never had a central bank. And every other function the central bank performs, you can relocate that in other institutions. So keeping the central bank in place is a risk that you should not take. In Ecuador, Correa was able to seize bank deposits because he had a central bank to be able to do it. So if you're going to dollarize, do it good, get rid of the central bank. Now, answering your question, what's the most important challenge? I think the real challenge to dollarize Argentina is not so much technical, how you do it. Like Emilio says, you have different ways to do this. If one particular way of dollarizing is not feasible, you can do it in different ways. I think the most important challenge is political. You have different, take for instance Ecuador. Ecuador dollarizes in the middle of a big crisis. You can say Ecuador dollarizes because of necessity. They have to. They don't know what to do. They throw the towel. We have to dollarize. Then you have El Salvador that dollarizes in a pretty good macroeconomic environment, and they dollarize because of conviction. So my take is Argentina is more like Ecuador. If Argentina dollarizes, it's because policymakers don't see a way out, and they should jump onto dollarization. So dollarization has different requirements. One is your dollarization technical plan, but then you need to have the political strength and commitment to push this. It's not just a one-person job, right? It's the government job to make this happen. You also need a full team that is in support of the idea of dollarizing and know how to do it. So I think the biggest challenge will be to make this political move and have it pass through Congress and whatever political requirement is needed.
It seems to me that there's the political objections, and then there are the theoretical objections to dollarization. One of them is you don't have enough dollars, and yet, as we've just mentioned, the country's already largely dollarized. And the other objection might be, well, it's already dollarized. Why do you need to make any changes?
Yeah. First of all, with the dollarization debate, the issue of not having enough dollars as dominated, and a lot of people have reached the wrong conclusion. The reality of the matter is that most of the money created in the economy is created by the banking system, not by the government itself. And what we're talking about here, or the three of us are talking about, is official dollarization, which means government accepting the dollar as legal tender, which means any private citizen can pay taxes in dollars. The private citizens of Argentina have already dollarized, so they already have the dollars. And in fact, you look at official statistics, and Argentines have between 5 and 6 times the amount of dollars than they have of pesos. So the Argentine economy is de facto dollarized. And as you were asking me, so well, if it's dollarized, what's the point? And the point is that there is a total incongruity between what the private sector is doing and the preference that the private sector has expressed for the dollar as a currency. And by the way, they didn't choose the dollar because they have a particular affinity with the United States. In fact, Argentina is probably the country in Latin America with the strongest anti-American sentiment. They did it because they needed to survive, because when you have rampant inflation, the only way to protect your savings and your purchasing power is by substituting the local currency for the dollars. But the fact that the government continues to impose on the Argentine people a currency that the Argentine people don't want generates a lot of friction and very high transaction costs. Imagine that all this liquidity that we have in dollars right now is outside of the banking system. So the government statistics say Argentines have $250 billion in outside of the banking system in liquidity. In particular, it's money and deposits. And just to give you a sense, the entire liquidity of the private sector in the banking system is probably about 65 billion at most. So the amount of dollars is really a multiple of the amount of pesos. And we also have dollars in the banking system. So, you know, the fact that this liquidity sits outside the formal banking system means that the banking system is not intermediating this massive liquidity. And whenever people want to actually buy something, because the dollar doesn't have legal tender, they have to sell their dollars for pesos. Now, the bid-ask spread in the currency market, in the foreign exchange market, is about anywhere between 3 and 5%. So that means that, you know, if you change $200 billion every year back and forth, people, when they save, they buy dollars, then when they spend, they sell them. We're talking about maybe 10 billion in transaction cost for the economy. That's a huge number. We're talking about 1.5% of GDP. So what I would say is that this inconsistency between what the private sector has done and what the public sector is doing is very costly to the economy. And why do we have this problem? It's because Argentina basically has 2 ways of financing its excess government spending. Either they print money or they raise debt internationally, because the local capital market is tiny. And so the government is between these 2 ways of financing its deficits, and basically it has a massive currency mismatch. It has a currency mismatch. Why? Because the government doesn't collect taxes in dollars. They collect them in pesos. So who generates dollars in Argentina? It's the exporters. It's the private sector. The government overspends. They need to raise dollars. They need to pay their foreign debt. And they need to take those dollars from the private sector. And usually the way they try to do that is they say, we're going to fix the exchange rate. We're going to put it below what is the market foreign exchange. And we're going to put all sorts of regulations and restrictions on transferring dollars, et cetera, which is what we have now with the CEPO. So that generates, as I said, a lot of friction, a lot of very high transaction costs, and creates this problem for the government. So if the Argentine government was able to collect taxes in dollars, for example, you would eliminate this currency mismatch, and you would eliminate a source of instability, because everybody is looking, for example, everybody's obsessed right now with what the debt that comes due next year and the year after. And so we have to pay, 11 billion to the bond market, and we have to pay the IMF. And everybody's obsessed with that data. And it's not only whether the Argentine government has a surplus or not, it's whether the Argentine government can get dollars. And those dollars are generated by the private sector. So I think this is a very important consideration. And again, just by saying that the Argentine is de facto dollarized, which is that the private sector spontaneously out of its own will, decided to adopt the dollar as their currency, it's not solving Argentina's problem because the government is not giving the dollar legal tender status, and in fact, is making it very difficult for people to use their dollars.
So what do you think, Nicolas, is a bigger obstacle? Is it the political obstacles to dollarization, or these theoretical objections that we sometimes hear, like there aren't enough dollars, or the sovereignty of the nation is expressed in its currency, and that kind of thing?
I think the theoretical objections in the case of Argentina are mostly that, theoretical objections. In Argentina, for instance, the central bank doesn't work as a lender of last resort because it doesn't issue the currency the market wants. So if you dollarize, a theoretical objection is you're going to lose your lender of last resort. Well, you don't have one, so you cannot lose it. If you look at Ecuador, El Salvador, Panama, they are dollarized. These countries may be known for a number of things, but bank runs is not one of them. So you can have a substitute to a lot of these theoretical concerns that replace this problem. So the issue of do you have enough dollars, that's amazing to me. Because different to the early 2000s, today we can go and see how different countries dollarize and what happened. We don't have to speculate. And we can go and see, for instance, when Ecuador dollarizes and they say you have this number of months to change the sucres for dollars, so the central bank has to change those bills for dollars, you should expect, and you see the currency circulation decreases because you are dollarizing, the central bank reserves are going down. And you don't see that. In Ecuador, the central bank reserve remains flat as you dollarize. So the whole idea that you have to make this calculation, how many pesos I have and how many dollars I have and I can do it or not do it, to me tells me that you haven't looked at how it's done closely. So all these technical discussions.
Sorry, Nico, if I may add, I think a lot of the analysts that have looked at the technical aspects of dollarization keep focusing on the apocalyptic scenario of liquidation. So liquidation is, okay, I dollarize and within 24 hours I need to cancel all liabilities in the economy. And it doesn't work like that. And Nico and I have emphasized this over and over again. It's a gradual process. Imagine that, as Nico was pointing out, in Ecuador, the government by law decided that the sucre was no longer going to be legal tender. So if you held sucres, they would be worthless after 6 months. And 6 months went by, and a third of the sucres in circulation had not been tendered. So the government had to extend the limit for another 3 months. So it took them 9 months to basically take out the entire monetary circulation. Just to put numbers in perspective, monetary circulation in Argentina right now is about $14, $15 billion, okay? And this is an economy of more than $600 billion. So this is the constraint. If this is the constraint we have, we don't have a constraint, okay? So I think, again, this is not a liquidation event, it's a going concern event. You're simply changing the unit account, and the government will have to retire a liability, a monetary liability, which is, once you freeze the amount of pesos in the economy, you will have to, people will exchange their pesos for dollars, but the purchasing power of the pesos in circulation will be exactly the same at the exchange rate of the dollars. So there's no reason why people should rush out and basically change their pesos for dollars. So there's a lot of confusion on that front. The other confusion arises because people think in terms of the government dollarizing at a rate that is below the market. And that would be a big mistake. You don't want to subsidize the dollar. Nico and I have hammered this point over and over again. You need to do dollarization at a market rate, because otherwise you're going to have a run on the dollar. So, as important as the amount of reserves in the central bank is, what is the exchange rate at which you...
So run us through, let's talk about how that might work in the case of Argentina. First of all, you would liberalize the exchange rate? You would have to open the economy. You know, Argentina has capital controls now, and it's a very closed economy. It's got a fixed exchange rate that's different than the free market, black market exchange rate. And so how would it work? It wouldn't be an overnight thing, as you just said. How do you envision it?
Well, you know, as I said, what you have to do is first you have to make an announcement that, you know, the central bank is not going to print any more pesos. So you have an amount of pesos in the economy today. You fix the amount of pesos. You fix the parity at which the peso and the dollar will be exchanged for each other. And then you basically declare legal tender, the dollar as a legal tender currency, and you dollarize the financial system. This is the way it was done in El Salvador.
A determined period of time,
You don't have to
period
give,
of time?
you could do two things. You could say the peso will disappear, okay? And what you have to analyze then is whether that's a politically viable proposition, whether you're going to be able to get Congress to do that. If you think that Congress is not going to accept the elimination of the peso, then you have to do an alternative. And this is very interesting. El Salvador was exactly in this predicament. When the government decided to dollarize, they went to Congress and there was opposition to eliminating the colon. And so the government said, fine, we're not going to eliminate the colon, but we're going to dollarize the financial system. So whenever you deposit your colones in the banking system, they get translated into dollars and credited into a dollar-denominated account. And you can go to the bank and get colones as well at the fixed exchange rate. So the process is you declare the dollar as legal tender, and that you can do through a law, or in Argentina you have what is called a DNU. You could do it either way, and obviously this is a political calculation. So I'm just saying the options. I'm not saying the government should do it one way or another. Then you have to make a commitment to stop money printing, and as Nico said, to give a clear message that the money printing functions of the central bank will be closed down, and the supervisory side of it, you can relocate or rename it or whatever. So you have to give a very clear message. And then the economy by itself will basically do the dollarization. It's going to be, you know, the government now talks about endogenous dollarization. We already have endogenous dollarization in Argentina. People have already dollarized. What we need is the exogenous, official dollarization.
Well, but Argentina has the so-called cepo. There are capital controls.
Yes.
So what is the ideal? You would want to do this in an open economy.
Ideally, you would want to lift restrictions so that you have an exchange rate that you can, you know, basically have some conviction that this is a market rate. So the fear is that the exchange rate would overshoot, like it happened in Ecuador. So in Ecuador, you know, at the time of dollarization, there was an exchange rate overshooting, but that corrected itself over a period of 18 months. So ideally, you want to have zero restrictions, but I want to emphasize a point here, Ian, is that when you talk about foreign exchange restrictions, this is not a binary thing. It's not like you have 0 or 1. You have like 52 shades of gray here. Okay. You can have any number of restrictions. For example, when Macri lifted the cepo in December 2015, he didn't really lift the cepo entirely.
The cepo is the
he relaxed
the capital controls.
Yes, he relaxed those restrictions significantly, but it took like 3 or 4 months to get rid of them altogether. So, you know, I think when people talk about the cepo, they keep thinking that this is a monolithic sort of binary thing, and it's not. And let me just make another point. Ecuador, for example, for a long period of time, as a dollarized economy, they had a 5% tax on capital flows. So a dollar outside of Ecuador technically was worth more than a dollar inside of Ecuador. If you had $100 outside of Ecuador, and you had $100 inside of Ecuador, those $100 inside of Ecuador were really worth 95, because if you wanted to wire them outside of the country, you would have to pay that tax. And dollarization worked with that anyway. And that, you know, that is what creates, when you have these restrictions, that's when you have that black market premium. The black
Right.
market premium is a reflection of the level of restrictions you have on the foreign exchange market. So what I'm trying to say is emphasize a point that Nico made. There's no perfect way to dollarize. You know, you need to have the political will and conviction that that's the way to go, and then you have to work around whatever obstacles you're going to have, because it's just not, you know, like simply deciding, okay, we're going to adopt the dollar tomorrow. There are political concerns, there are financial concerns, there are all sorts of factors that you have to consider. So there's no one size fits all, there's no one perfect recipe. There's a realistic recipe that has to take into consideration whatever constraints there are.
Alfredo?
Yeah, still there are some doubts, you know, related to dollarization, and I think that I would like to highlight 2 points. The first one, that nowadays it's much more expensive to dollarize. Our exchange rate has appreciated, our peso nowadays, and that is bad news, because you need at least $10 billion, you know, to buy the monetary base. And well, a couple of months ago, that was really cheap. So, and the other thing, it's about the international reserves. Argentina still, we have $4 billion of negative international reserves. And yes, we have a lot of dollars. We are the second economy in the world with more dollars per capita. That's real. But still, there is no confidence. And the problem is what is going to happen next year if still Javier Milei is going to, you know, to keep all this great image, positive image, and it's going to vert in votes. And that is a good question, and we still don't know the answer, because, you know, the political analysts, they just said a couple of days ago that the chances of Trump winning, you know, the elections were reduced, and even though he won the elections. So in Argentina, it was something we have something similar during 2023. So it's really important that the government, you know, get the results, the good results during the elections, and that will be the best scenario to keep the path in dollarization, because you need to give the legal status. And that is only going to happen if there is a political consensus. Otherwise, if you only have the DNU, as Emilio said, I think that is really fragile, you know, and it only going to and obviously, I think that Argentina may suffer a shock, probably an economic shock. If the results are really bad for the government next year, we can have an internal shock for our economy. And if we don't have capital controls, that still we have, who knows what is the price of the dollar. If you think that in 2027, Cristina Fernandez or whoever is going to win the elections, we don't have you know, a price. Yeah, I think that is really important. And the capital controls, I would like to add this, that it's, you know, nowadays the question is when we are going to leave capital controls, or when is the right time. I think that we have to understand that Argentina is a fragile economy. We still have 100 points of our, sovereign risk. You know, we don't have access to markets, and we have made a lot of, as I emphasized, a lot of, we have reduced significantly our fiscal budget, and our monetary policy is fixed. We don't print money, and still we don't have access to the markets. So that is a signal that we have to respect, and the market is telling you something, and you need to to keep on this path of discipline, fiscal and monetary discipline. So yeah, we have a lot of challenges. We have achieved, I think that Javier Milei has achieved a lot of things, important things. The deregularization of the economy also, it's very important. Yeah. What Sturzenegger is doing right now, it's very important to reduce the Argentinian cost, but still we have a lot of challenges in the midterm.
When you say DNU, you're referring to presidential decrees in case
Executive,
some of the viewers might not be aware. I would like to take a question from the audience. Unless Nico, did you want to say something about what was just said, or shall we just go to the question? Go ahead.
I say let's skip time to the questions.
Okay, so we have a question from Sylvia Cavalcant from Arizona, and she asks, critics argue that dollarization could increase Argentina's vulnerability to external shocks, especially from U.S. interest rate changes, and view it as shock therapy. How would Argentina manage these risks? Additionally, how might dollarization impact inflation, the cost of living and inflation? But I think the first part of the question is...
Yeah, this has been one of the arguments that has been used many times on the debate, whether dollarization makes you more vulnerable. And when you look at the data, it doesn't really, the argument doesn't stand. I mean, you look at Ecuador, and you look at the shocks that they had during the last 25 years. They had the global financial crisis in 2008. They had an internal shock, which was Correa. Then they had the reversion of the commodity prices. I mean, the crude oil, which accounts for like 2/3 of Ecuador's exports, fell from 2012 to 2017 by almost 2/3. They had an earthquake in 2016. They had the COVID crisis in 2020. And when you look at the data, what does it tell you? That the volatility of GDP growth wasn't higher. You look at the inflation was much lower. So the idea that somehow Argentina now is isolated, I mean, this whole argument starts from the premise that right now we're kind of isolated from external shocks, and that's actually untrue. I mean, Argentina is actually very vulnerable to external shocks. Anybody who lives here knows that. Whenever the Fed raises rates, we take the hit immediately. So there's a confusion here of idealizing the status quo. With dollarization, there's always this trade-off between credibility and flexibility. And people say, oh, we need to have flexibility to adapt to external shocks. But when you go back in history and you look at when policymakers actually use policies to isolate Argentina or to somehow neutralize or moderate the impact of foreign shocks, you realize that never happened. So we're talking about a nirvana fallacy, which is, we dollarize and we're going to lose these marvelous policies that would allow us to basically moderate the impact of those shocks. And the answer is, we never use those policies properly. And part of the problem is exactly that flexibility. When you go back to the debate of credibility and flexibility, you realize that flexibility in the hands of a populist government gets you to hyperinflation. So it
creates internal shocks more often than you get external shocks.
The internal shocks are actually worse than any external shock.
Yeah, and not only that, in the last 100 years, we are the economy with more recessions, with more periods of recession during if you compare to any other economy. And we had our own currency, and we have our own monetary policy. So the problem is not if we fix to dollarization, or if we decide to keep aside, what politicians have used, these tools, monetary tools, in order to, to gain power or to try to win elections.
Here's another question from a viewer. Tell us about dollarization and growth. The last 4 years of convertibility, the Argentine economy was in the doldrums. The number of Ecuadorians in the U.S. or in Spain seems to show the outcome there. Argentina desperately needs to get out of stagnation lasting more than a decade already. And by convertibility, I think that the writer was talking about that period of time in the 1990s up until the early 2000s, where you had a currency board system of a fixed exchange rate, which ended up blowing up. How do you compare that to what you're advocating?
Well, first of all, convertibility had something that is very different from what we're proposing, which was a financial system with two currencies. You had the peso and you had the dollar. And convertibility was not the problem. Convertibility was a very good system. The problem was our politicians. And politicians started making noises about the end of convertibility already in 1999. Imagine in 1999 we had a presidential election, and the leader of the Peronist Party, which Menem was part of, Eduardo Duhalde, was very openly talking about putting an end to convertibility in '99. And people actually voted to keep convertibility, and they voted for De la Rúa. But within De la Rúa's party, there was somebody called Alfonsín, who was the leader of the Radical Party here, and he was against convertibility as well. And so what you had in Argentina was a combination of an external shock, which was essentially a succession of international crises, Russia, Brazil in '99, the devaluation of Brazil. But then you had something that was even worse, which was an internal shock, which was a political shock. And the political shock created so much uncertainty that people started taking money out of the banks. Local interest rates skyrocketed. Banks were, put into an impossible situation with a currency mismatch. So I think to derive conclusions from that experience with a very simple-minded approach will get you the wrong conclusion. I think the fact that there are a lot of Ecuadorians living outside of Ecuador doesn't mean anything. The data shows that Ecuador's GDP growth for the last 20 years has been double that of Argentina. And to come back to the issue of growth, the key issue for Argentina is growth. Since 2011, Argentina hasn't grown. Okay, the economy has stagnated. So we have one of the worst macroeconomic performances. But look at the investment rate. Argentina, the average investment rate for the last 17, 20 years has been about 17% of GDP. Now, it's calculated that about 15% of GDP is depreciation alone. So if you're investing 17% of GDP, there's 15% that is simply going to replace depreciation of your capital stock. So there's no way you can grow with this investment rate. Now, Argentina has another problem, which is a savings rate that is even below this, which means we never have enough money inside of Argentina. We never generate enough savings to finance the investment that we have. And that's why we have current account deficits. Now, the issue is you want to grow, really, you need to invest 22, 23% of GDP like Peru, Colombia, Chile have been doing for the last 10 years. So how do you get from 17 to 25 if your savings rate is so low? And dollarization will help you in a massive way, because what it's going to do is to help you increase your domestic savings rate. Because this amount of dollars that are now sitting outside of the banking system, people don't trust the banking system, because in Argentina, historically, the government has basically done things that they shouldn't have done. So people are still, worried. And I think they're very positive signs. Alfredo was talking about the tax amnesty. The tax amnesty generated an increase in dollar deposits in the Argentine banking system of about 20 billion. Now, the problem is that that is not translating into an equivalent amount of credit, because the restrictions on bank lending in dollars are very strict. So I think dollarization actually would help Argentina growth, because one of the things that it will do is it will help increase the Argentine savings rate, which is something that we need, because there's not enough money abroad willing to invest in Argentina at this point to allow us to go from an investment rate of 17% to 22 or 25%.
Yeah, I mean, the claim you're making is not that dollarization is going to solve all problems, but that it can help produce growth and create a...
Actually, I would rephrase what you're saying. You're making a very important point, and in our debates, we always emphasize it. You cannot ask from dollarization more than it can deliver.
That's right.
Dollarization is going to do only one thing. It will limit the amount of damage populist governments can do by financing their excess spending with money printing. That's the only thing that you want dollarization to do. Don't ask dollarization to do other things. But when you give the private sector price stability, clear rules of the game, you do structural reforms, you open the economy, then that is the recipe.
Nicolas, I have a question. related to this topic from Jeffrey Lawrence, who asked, can dollarization help to reduce labor and business informality? That's kind of related to another concern about dollarization, which is this is a country with very rigid labor laws. And how does dollarization impact the employment situation when you have a rigid labor system?
Well, let me build on Emilio's comment and your comment. The way I see dollarization is not a sufficient reform to fix Argentina. It's a necessary component. You need to bring price stability in a credible way. And one of the things this gives you is the political space, the power, and the incentive to move forward with other reforms. Now, if you dollarize and you don't do labor market reforms, it's more expensive to you than if you are not dollarized. You can inflate wages away if you have your own central bank. But if you are dollarized, now you have a stronger incentive to move forward. So dollarization gives you the capacity and to some extent the incentive to do those reforms. So I wouldn't ask dollarization to solve a labor market reform, but dollarization is a tool that allows you to do that. So we shouldn't be thinking about dollarization as this is the reform. You should think about dollarization as a reform that opens the door for you to finally do the other reforms in a credible way. Now you have to stick to them, you have to move forward because it's more expensive for you to not do those reforms.
Yeah, I will add that I think that dollarization will boost confidence in Argentina, definitely. I think that Javier Milei won the elections because he promised dollarization and to reduce the size of the state, and those were the two clear messages. And I just said the tax amnesty is the first step or the first part of an economic program that can really, get even better results in the midterm. So yeah, I think that also not only confidence, but also reduce volatility. When you have an economy with a lot of volatility, that is really, Emilio just said about investment, and we don't have investment in Argentina because we have high inflation, we have deficits, and we don't have any monetary policy that it's that has stayed for a long period of time. In this sense, I think that, yeah, definitely the dollarization keep this path in order to increase the chances or the probabilities that a lot of these dollars that they are under the mattress that the Argentinians have, and it's almost 1 GDP of our country, we can, flow, they can flow into the economy, in the real economy.
Yeah, if I may, I want to add something, because I think none of us and none of the economists, the long list of illustrious economists that have advocated dollarization, starting with Milton Friedman back in 1973 in a congressional hearing in the US, who said for the first time Argentina should dollarize. But we had people like Dornbush, Alesina, Barro, Guillermo Calvo. There's so many economists that have already answered potion. Dollarization is not a magic potion. And in economic policy, you need an instrument for an objective. And dollarization will do one thing: kill inflation. That's what it will do. It will not solve all your other problems. But as you pointed out earlier, Ecuador, for example, they dollarized, they did some reforms. Then Correa came along, he reverted a lot of those reforms. He did a lot of things that he shouldn't have done. He saddled the economy with debt. He had deficits that were very similar to those Cristina Kirchner had in Argentina. So if you look at the fiscal deficits of Ecuador from 2007 until 2015, and you put them next to Argentina's, they're pretty much the same. So look at where we ended up. We ended up, after 20 years of populism, we ended up with an almost hyperinflation, 25% a month in December 2023, 25% a month. Now, Philip Kagan used to say that when he studied the European hyperinflations, that when a country goes above 50% a month, it's technically in hyperinflation. That was a very arbitrary definition. The truth is, When you are above 15, 20% a month, you are in hyperinflation territory. So the difference is, the one thing that dollarization did for Ecuador is it prevented Ecuador to end up like Venezuela. It's very simple. And we ended up in a very bad place. And thank God, since December, things have been changing and we're going in a different direction. And the issue right now is, can we trust that this time is different? Can we believe that the probability that we're going to have bad governments in the future is 0%? Do we really believe that in the next 15 years, we're not going to see Kicillof or any of these guys being able to get to the president, a country that is notoriously addicted to populism? So dollarization is not for good governments. If we knew that we're going to have good governments from now on till the end of time, we wouldn't worry about this. But that would be a very naive way of looking at things.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, and I would like to add that the problem with reversion of all these measures and policies, and that's the thing. If you come, in the next 3 years, for example, imagine Peronism wins the president's election, and how many days will they keep, this monetary and fiscal discipline? So dollarization has shown us, not only in Ecuador but in other places as Salvador, that dollarization is even more popular than the politics, and that is great because the cost, to reverse that policy, it's really high. And if you have that, you don't have any more incentives. And that's the problem for Correa. That was the problem for Correa. He hated dollarization. He has to use the central bank in order, to print money or to use as a way to finance deficits, as just Emilio said, even though he couldn't reverse the dollarization. And probably if we have during convertibility, instead of convertibility, we'll have a dollarization, will probably still be on dollarization.
Let me add this. Milton Friedman had this quote that I think is fantastic. He said, in a democracy, the way to solve things is to make it politically profitable for bad governments to do the right thing. And I would say the other way to rephrase it is to make it politically unprofitable to do the wrong thing for bad governments. And dollarization allows you to create that political incentive, because as Alfredo was mentioning, even the people who voted for Correa in Ecuador, and he was the most popular politician in the history of the country, they wanted to earn their salary in dollars. They were not willing to give their dollars away.
He couldn't de-dollarize in a democracy. Well, we have a question here from somebody who says, why would a non-Milei parliament, and Congress here is not controlled by the president, he has a minority in Congress, tie its own hands in the future by dollarization? The question is, dollarization may be a good idea, but getting from here to there is a political process. So maybe that explains why it hasn't happened so far. Maybe there's political reasons, maybe there's theoretical reasons why it hasn't happened so far.
Well, what I would say is Milei won with the highest margin in any election since 1983, and his platform centered around dollarization. So clearly there was political support for him to dollarize, which doesn't in any way mean that I think it's a walk in the park or anything. But let's rephrase this. What does dollarization mean? We need to understand what does dollarization mean. In the case of Argentina, it means giving legal tender status to the dollar. If you go to Congress and you say, listen, we want to eliminate the peso forever, and you're probably not going to get enough votes to do anything, but you're going in a different direction. You're saying, listen, everybody knows Argentines have a lot of dollars. Let's make it easier for people to use those dollars, because right now they're spending, out of every $100 they have, they're spending 5 whenever they buy or sell dollars. That's a very high transaction cost for people that is basically borne by the lowest the lowest income segments of society. And so this is a really an equal opportunity policy. You're allowing the poorer people to basically have the same advantages that the richer people who have already dollarized themselves. So I think the political aspects, and I'm not a politician, and so I'm not going to, I think, have the perfect answer, the perfect solution to this problem. But I think you need to rephrase or reframe the way you approach this. This is not about eliminating the peso. This is about recognizing a fact. What is this fact? The fact is that Argentines prefer the dollar to the peso, and that they have between 5 or 6 times the amount of dollars in liquidity than they have liquidity in pesos. So that's a fact. That's not, and so let's make that liquidity come back to the economy, because that liquidity right now is completely outside the flow, the circular flow of the Argentine economy. And so the dollars go in when people save, and then when they have to spend, they use those dollars. And so let's just give the dollar legal tender. Let's recognize that the private sector has chosen this currency. But we're not going to eliminate the peso. At least we're not going to eliminate it initially.
I think that certainly makes the political argument more feasible, and I agree with Alfredo that it's probably best if this went through Congress and you had a sort of a political settlement on this and an agreement. That might initially explain why it hasn't been pursued, among other reasons. Nicolas, did you want to add anything else to this to this part of the discussion about the fact that it hasn't happened yet in Argentina, and what would be the best way forward politically?
Well, ideally, you want dollarization to happen under ideal conditions, but it doesn't have to be the case. So we're in a world of second best. We're not talking about the ideal scenario. For better or worse, I think the most likely scenario in Argentina is dollarization will happen out of an emergency. And that's what will change the political motivation to do this. We tried everything in Argentina. As I mentioned before, even inflation targeting failed, which was run by the dream team of Ivy League economists. So the problem is not, having the right economists in the central bank. The problem is much more deep-rooted. So you need to have the political conviction to do this. It's not just a technical problem. The big question is, one, at which point this conviction will turn on and push for this. Now, when we talk about dollarization, we don't have to think. We have to do this right now. We're thinking about a long-term solution for Argentina. We're not trying to find quick solutions to the problem. We're trying to find an institutional reform that will provide a mid-long-term, finally, price stability to this country. So I'm not surprised if it's not happening right now. It may happen a few years down the road, but eventually, as of now, that's what Argentina is working. It's working to, I need to do something with the peso, and anything we try fails, what do you have left? Dollarization. So I don't have an answer of when this will happen, but I understand what the political problem is.
And if I may add, I think Javier Milei is convinced that dollarization is the way to go. And if he hasn't done it yet, it's because he made a political calculation regarding what kind of support he can get. And my sense is that the next political test in Argentina, obviously, is October 2025. And so the government has been very successful so far, and they expect that this success will allow them to strengthen their position in Congress and strengthen their ability to make a decision about dollarization. And again, I would emphasize what I said at the beginning. Dollarization is like a sandwich with the dollar being the bread. You can do it in many other ways. Let's not forget that one of the key things about dollarization is what kind of banking system you want to have. And for example, Javier Milei has talked many times about having a full reserve banking system, like a Simon's kind of proposal. If you have that, then the challenge is higher because you need more reserves, because you need to back up, not only you need to stand prepared to redeem all the pesos in circulation, but also all the deposits, the current account deposits. So it's a different order of magnitude. So these are concerns that he may have. He may think, I don't know because I haven't talked to him since last November, but maybe what he has in mind is a dollarization with full reserve banking, in which case, again, not only you have the political decision, but you have to think about the issue of reserves. And I would like to add another point when this whole discussion about whether there are enough reserves in Argentina for dollarization, and people forget what is the alternative. I mean, to believe that you can have a free system, like free capital movements and free exchange rates without having reserves is absolute nonsense. So, in fact, as Nico and I have pointed out many times, probably under dollarization, you need less reserves than you would need if you wanted to do a freely floating exchange rate system or a dirty floating system. So the truth is that as important as the level of reserves is the credibility of the government on the fiscal front and the credibility of the monetary regime itself. The advantage of dollarization is that it's a very credible commitment device. It's a very credible system in terms of not allowing governments to bypass the restrictions it imposes.
The other countries that have dollarized have maintained a fractional reserve banking system,
Yes.
right? It hasn't been 100%,
There's
and that
no
has not
country.
been
There's no
problematic.
country in the world that has full reserve banking, but this is part of what when Javier Milei started his campaign, he had he announced that he wanted to do this. So
we have time for a couple more questions. Did you want to say something? We have time for a couple more questions. Here's one. If Argentina were to dollarize, how long would it take for the price level to stabilize? I think there's a concern there.
Yeah.
Well, that's right. You have to know the details. I think there's a concern there that.
Yeah, I had when I started, thinking about dollarization for Argentina, I thought obviously that the best way was in a real crisis, a really big crisis, financial or whatever. But nowadays, I think that no, there is another way to dollarize, and maybe this is the right path, to get all the support from politicians in the Congress in order to first legalize the dollar, give him the state of legal, and then move forward. Because I say this because that is a really crucial question. What is the price that you fix the peso in order to buy the monetary base or to start this process? And nowadays we have seen that the peso has obviously strengthened. We have a peso that it has the inflation has been moving forward, even though our dollar has depreciated, and that is bad news. As I just said, it's even more expensive nowadays to dollarize, and we don't even know which is the real market price for dollar because we have capital controls.
Yeah. Here's a question. Is there any degree of coordination with the United States that might be involved in dollarization?
Well, if we look at the experience of other countries, there was the decision was unilateral. I think in the case of Ecuador in particular, the IMF was against it, and the U.S. Treasury was not consulted before Jamil Mawad announced dollarization. In the case of El Salvador, there was more coordination. Argentina is a bigger economy, is part of G20, so I would imagine that the decision to dollarize would have to be, I think an unilateral decision for Argentina would not make sense. I think it would have to be, discussed in advance. On the other hand, I would tell you, I don't think the U.S. government will ever officially support any country to dollarize, because that's a kind of a foreign policy decision. So I don't think you can expect that the U.S. government will, publicly announce, oh, we are in favor of dollarization. Choosing a monetary regime is a sovereign decision. And now, again, going back to the first question you asked me, which is semantics, what exactly you're talking about. And in this case is, hey, we're not eliminating the peso. I mean, we're just freezing the amount of pesos in the economy, and we're just giving legal tender status to a currency that the Argentine people already have. So that's not such a controversial, sort of.
Doesn't Milei's vision include people just having the choice to use any currency, or really it's a freedom issue for him, isn't it?
But the way we frame dollarization in our case is complete monetary freedom. Nobody's forced to use the dollar. Yeah. And I think this is very important, because there's this notion, oh, you want to impose the dollar on the Argentine people. No, that's not the case. Right. We just want to allow the people who have dollars to use those dollars freely. And if they want to change those dollars for euros or any other convertible currency, or even Bitcoin or any stable coin, any cryptocurrency, that's fine.
It's just the case that they're choosing dollars.
Dollarization in some ways is the wrong word, because it's
right.
complete monetary freedom, what we're talking about. Get the technocrats out of the equation. Why do we accept the state monopoly in the creation of money? Why do we accept, I mean, we're free to choose what car we drive, what clothes we wear, where do we live, but the government doesn't let us choose which currency is better suited to our needs, or which currency we prefer. So this is about monetary freedom. The dollarization, we in this group at least, because we've talked about it many times, is one where is about freedom. It's about giving freedom to people and getting the technocrats who have shown themselves incapable of giving us price stability, get the technocrats out of the picture and just let the private sector make its own decisions when it comes to money.
Well put. I'm afraid that we've run out of time, and I think that that's a good point to leave it at, because, of course, all of Milei's economic reforms and the other reforms that he's doing are really guided by the idea of increasing freedom to people, returning that freedom that has been taken away from them over the past 20 or 100 years. And in the monetary sphere, it's no different. This is not just an economic argument. It's not just an economic efficiency argument, although those are very strong. It's, at bottom, a human freedom argument. And I think that in the context of Argentina, the dollarization debate is really a part of the overall freedom debate. Thank you, guys, for joining us. Thank you, Nicolas, for joining us remotely. Thank you all for watching. And we'll see you next time on the next Cato Forum. Thanks very much.